In today's episode, we're going to talk about some of the limitations of caffeine. I'll see you inside. Alright, let's just hop right into this one. Caffeine habituation is a common complication that occurs with long-term caffeine consumption. Essentially, long-term caffeine consumption decreases how exciting the same dose of caffeine is. This is very similar to a lot of things within our physiology. One great example is dopamine. There's a bunch of ramifications of always having high dopamine, which makes the same amount of dopamine actually start to feel less exciting. Or in the case of dopamine, I guess I would say less motivating. Another example is actually our taste receptors. Over time, we habituate to a specific dose of sweetness, and a lot of times need to continue to increase the amount of actual sweetener that we're using to elicit the same response. And now let's talk about how caffeine does this. So the proposed mechanism of caffeine habituation is an increase in the density of adenosine receptors and an increase in caffeine metabolizing enzymes. So let's first talk about adenosine receptor density. As we discussed last episode, adenosine is the molecule that binds to the adenosine receptor to promote sleepiness, which means that the more adenosine receptors there are, the more likely adenosine will be to bind to a receptor and send a tiredness signal. So to put some hypothetical numbers around it, let's say typically we have 100 receptors and 100 molecules of caffeine. When we drink that amount of caffeine, all 100 receptors are filled up and there's no adenosine able to hit the receptor. And now a lot of times after we've had a specific dose of caffeine for a prolonged period of time, we'll actually increase the amount of adenosine receptors we have to cope with this. Which means maybe one dose of caffeine fills 100 receptors, so the brain is smart enough to lay down 120 receptors. And when I say lay down, I simply just mean to express on the outside of different cells and neurons within the brain. So now we may have 100 molecules of caffeine bound to receptors, but there's also 20 open receptors that adenosine can bind to. So there's still a small tiredness signal that's being promoted because of the extra receptors. Now this is very interesting because a lot of people report not feeling as energized from caffeine after they've had it for a long time. However, a lot of studies suggest that the performance benefits of caffeine are still there, they're just not able to perceive these benefits. And now I think the likely cause of this is that caffeine will still increase the amount of endorphins that we have, allowing us to do more work and perform better, but it does not blunt the adenosine tiredness promoting signal as much. So we actually feel more tired doing the same amount of work because of adenosine. But we're still able to perform because of the endorphins. So it seems like having caffeine over a prolonged period of time may not affect our physical performance, but it may affect our mental performance, which may also decrease our motivation and willingness to do physical work, which could eventually decrease our physical performance. Now, the other effect is actually the caffeine metabolizing enzymes. Simply put, these enzymes are responsible for removing caffeine from the receptor. The more of these enzymes we have, the quicker the caffeine will be removed from the receptor. And your sensitivity to caffeine is predicated on how long caffeine stays inside the receptor. So the quicker it is removed, the less of an effect of caffeine you will have. And now both of these occur after we've had a specific dose of caffeine for a long period of time. As caffeine is a foreign molecule, the body tends to adapt to it when it's constantly around to try and get back to homeostasis. The sheer state of having caffeine bound to the adenosine receptor and nothing happening is different than what the body expects. So when this occurs for a long period of time, the body is smart enough to put down more adenosine receptors so adenosine can still work despite the caffeine. And it upregulates its ability to get rid of the caffeine because it is technically a foreign molecule. Alright, I think this is where I'm going to end today's discussion on why you actually begin to habituate to caffeine. And the next discussion will likely be on caffeine toxicity and what happens when you take too much. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next episode.